Welcome to this explainer. Right now, we're diving into a massive, high-stakes legal tug-of-war over a life-saving drug called nevirapine. This isn't just your standard courtroom drama. It is a profound fundamental clash between the South African government and the country's highest courts. On one side, we have state health policy, and on the exact opposite side, an urgent push to provide critical medication to vulnerable citizens. It's a genuinely fascinating look at what actually happens when the slow wheels of government policy collide head-on with immediate human needs. Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to break this whole complex ruling down step by step. First, a life-saving court order. Second, the interim execution battle. Third, the government's case. Fourth, the court's rebuttal. And finally, number 5, power, policy, and health. Starting right off with Section 1, a life-saving court order and the absolute stakes of nevirapine. Before we get completely lost in the heavy legal maneuvering, we really need to ground this in reality. Because the stakes here, they are absolutely crucial. We aren't just analyzing dry legal rules or some abstract concept of administrative law. This entire case revolves around access to medication for pregnant mothers with HIV and their newborn babies. Literally a matter of life and death. And honestly, that makes the legal mechanisms used to fight over it all the more intense. The spark that ignited this whole legal wildfire was struck on December 14, 2001. The South African High Court issued an order requiring the government to make nevirapine available to HIV-positive pregnant women giving birth in the public sector and to their babies. At the time, the government actually already had a pilot program going, but it was limited to just 2 test sites per province. This court order basically mandated that they expand access to public health facilities outside of those few test sites. But, and this is key, the court didn't just say, hey, give this drug to everyone, everywhere, all at once. They used very specific medical terminology. They ordered it to be available only when it was medically indicated. Let's just unpack that jargon for a second. It simply means that a consulting doctor actually looks at a patient, considers their specific health and social circumstances, and decides, yes, they would benefit from this medication. It's just about trusting a doctor's professional judgment. And what's kind of fascinating is that the government itself used this exact phrase, medically indicated, in their own affidavits. So the court was just asking doctors to, well, be doctors. Moving on to Section 2, the interim execution battle. Or, as it's probably better described, the legal ping pong. Now, you might be wondering, wouldn't a court order to provide life-saving medicine just be the end of the story? Well, not quite. The government immediately launched an appeal to pause this mandate, and that kicked off a high-speed game of legal ping pong. To really grasp this battle, we have to understand the concept of an interlocutory order. In plain, everyday terms, it's just a temporary ruling. It's basically a judge looking at a situation and saying, okay, we still have to argue the main case later, but do this right now to prevent a massive injustice in the meantime. Usually, when you appeal a court order, that order gets automatically suspended until the appeal is heard. But if you appeal a temporary, urgent order, you defeat its entire purpose. The whole point of the order is that it simply cannot wait. This rapid-fire procedural history is pretty wild to see untangled. On December 14th, the High Court makes the original order. The government immediately appeals. So on March 11th, the High Court issues that interim execution order we just talked about, saying, implement the drug policy right now while we wait for the appeal. The government tries to appeal that temporary order on March 25th, but the High Court basically says, no way, and refuses to let them. So just 2 days later, on March 27, the government takes the whole shebang all the way up to the Constitutional Court. All of this intense, high-stakes legal fighting was compressed into just a couple of months. That brings us to Section 3, the government's case. Why on earth fight this order? We have to ask the rhetorical question here. Why? Why did the government fight so incredibly hard, appealing at literally every possible level, just to stop a temporary order meant to distribute medicine to mothers and babies? Let's systematically lay out the government's specific complaints. They brought a list of distinct grievances to the Constitutional Court. First, they argued that implementing this order would cause irreparable harm to the state. They also claimed the terms of the order were just completely vague and uncertain. They felt it was dangerously prescriptive, that it actively undermined good governance in the public health sector, and finally, they argued it invalidly made a broad policy choice on behalf of the state. It was a full-scale, all-out assault on the High Court's ruling. Which leads us to Section 4, the court's rebuttal. Let's see how they dismantled these claims. Now, what's really interesting is how the Constitutional Court actually responds to all this. Let's look at the first major clash. The government claimed that handing out this medicine right now would cause irreversible, irreparable harm to the state. But the Constitutional Court offered a pretty sharp reality check. They stated that requiring the government to provide nevirapine where facilities already exist, well, that might cause mere inconvenience, sure, but it certainly does not constitute irreparable harm to the public health services. And notably, everyone actually agreed that the financial cost of the drug itself was not the issue here. Then, there was this whole argument about the order being vague. The government claimed that the phrase medically indicated was just too uncertain for them to follow. The court found this highly ironic, pointing out again that the government itself literally used this exact phrase in its own paperwork. The court's reality check, it isn't vague at all. It just requires a doctor to look at the risks and benefits outlined in the package insert that's already required by the Medicines Control Council. It is completely standard, established medical practice. Furthermore, the court pointed out that the original order didn't force some chaotic, reckless, nationwide rollout everywhere all at once. Actually, they set strict, very limited preconditions. Nevirapine was only to be provided if 3 specific steps were met. First, the public health facility already had to have testing and counseling in place. Second, the attending doctor had to deem the drug medically indicated. And third, the doctor had to act in consultation with the medical superintendent of the facility. So that's a highly controlled environment, absolutely not a vague free-for-all. So the crucial point here is how the court handled the government's intense fear of losing control. The government basically argued that letting doctors and superintendents decide when to prescribe this drug completely undermined good public health governance. The court beautifully dismantled this by separating policy from practice. Yes, the state is absolutely responsible for broad policy and deciding the general range of available medications. But the court ruled that prescribing a specific medication to an individual patient, that is inherently an on-the-spot professional judgment by a doctor. To put it simply, governance sets the menu, but the doctor chooses the meal. And that brings us to our final part, Section 5, Power, Policy, and Health. Who really has the final say? This is the overarching constitutional theme of this entire battle. We're talking about power, policy, and health. And ultimately, who gets the final say in a constitutional democracy? The government's ultimate, absolute, heaviest defense was a constitutional one. They argued that the High Court's order was a complete nullity because it breached the separation of powers. They firmly believed the courts were essentially trespassing on the exclusive domain of the legislature and executive branches by forcing the government's hand on a health policy issue. The Constitutional Court's response to this is a truly defining statement on judicial power. They said, and I quote, "Should a court find the government to be in breach of these obligations, the court is required to provide effective relief to remedy that breach." Let that sink in for a second. The Constitution doesn't just casually allow courts to step in when the government fails its human rights obligations. It requires them to. Formulating relief to fix a constitutional breach isn't trespassing on the executive branch at all. It's the judiciary doing exactly what the Constitution designed it to do. In the end, the government's arguments failed so comprehensively that not only was their application for leave to appeal completely dismissed, but they were hit with a massive financial penalty. The government was ordered to pay the legal costs for both the application for leave to appeal and the counter-application. And just to emphasize the sheer magnitude of their loss, they were ordered to cover the costs of not just one, but 2 legal counsel for the respondents. Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought to chew on. Consider the delicate balance of a democracy. When state policy actively fails to protect the most vulnerable members of the public, who should really have the final say? Is it the elected government, preserving its right to dictate policy and governance? Or is it the courts, wielding the Constitution to demand immediate life-saving relief? It's a profound question of accountability that this case absolutely forces us to confront. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I hope this really helped you structure and understand this monumental legal clash.